Great. I would like to introduce our next two presenters. We have Colin Cowie and Andreas Klopsch.
Yes.
I'm looking at the wrong people for those right names. Enjoy, everybody.
Hello, everyone. So yeah, my name is Andreas Klopsch. I work at Sophos as a senior threat researcher in the lab's dynamic protection team.
And I'm Colin Cowie. I also work for Sophos. I do threat intelligence supporting our managed detection response service.
So we are going to present AuKill and no filler, exploring the current state of EDR killers in real-world attacks. Matt Wixie was also a great contributor to this talk. He can't be with us today. So he's from London, and for him it's also not that easy to come here. So we're presenting this talk, but he made a great work on the darknet stuff you're about to see today. And yeah, let's get started with the agenda. So we are going to talk, first of all, about how we ended up here, why there is a rise in EDR killers, the methods those use, and also a little bit about evasion and EDR killing, so basically what the differences are. Then we are going to jump over to presenting two of those EDR killers, AuKill and Poortry, which we've seen in incidents last year and oftentimes this year. And that's the technical part. The second part will be about threat intelligence and our findings on the darknet. And in that case, Colin will take over and talk a little bit about the stuff we found on the darknet, meaning like which of those which services we found, and then we are going to continue to the threat intelligence part, like which ransomware affiliated groups use which EDR killers and drivers in their attacks. So how did we end up here? So basically, if we go back in time to, I don't even know when the first AV scanners came in, or AV programs, if we remember the very old ones, all we had was basically static detection. So you had your byte pattern, your malicious bytes, your, I don't know, like malicious string somewhere, some static attributes to the file. You had some file sizes maybe, and through combination of those, you had your pattern basically, or your signature on a set of files you want to detect. And clearly that was not enough. Soon we had packers, we had string obfuscation, code obfuscation, and that means that with only static signatures, we are not getting anywhere today. So you can't protect anything anymore just by using Yarrow roots, for example. Soon they'll get in. So what happened next probably is that we had behavioral detection. So you have hooks now. You can use some object notify routines on Windows, for example, to monitor what happens on the system through these techniques. And that's clearly also not enough. There are again techniques to bypass that. So attackers evolved again. We have living off the land binaries you can use to make basically behavior on the system look like legitimate behavior. You also have methods to remove those hooks. So now we are at a pace where the feature list basically grows and grows, and you have many features in an EDR system, and evasion basically also gets harder. So if we just take like a very hypothetical attack that consists of 4 steps here. Let's say the attackers have initial access through some Office document that is weaponized with macros, malicious macros. Then in the next step, the malware escalates privileges through DLL search order hijacking. Then they try to disable the agent maybe and try to load a rootkit and own the system completely. So if we think about the different detections or technologies that hit in there, we have in the first step, we have static behavioral detection. We also have network threat protection, which I didn't mention, which can also block maybe the IP address where the payload is downloaded from. You have AMSI scanning, which can dump if they use, for example, PowerShell codes, the decoded PowerShell codes will be dumped. You have on the second step, again, and third, fourth step, each time static and behavioral detection. And again, Microsoft provides tamper protection. So if you have an EDR agent, you can use process protected light. So you can't just turn off those EDR agents anymore. And in the last step, if they try to load a rootkit, it has to have a valid code signing signature. Otherwise, the file will not load. So the key takeaway is basically that evasion is getting harder and harder. Of course, attackers evolve, and there will always be ways to evade such a system. But at some point, as an attacker, especially if you think about ransomware, you might not want to evade anymore. You just want to disable it. So let's think about ransomware. If you're about to encrypt the system, you don't want to evade anymore. You just want to turn it off and then basically encrypt all the files, which is a safer method than trying to find some sneaky way to trick the AV that you're not doing file encryption. And what attackers often do is they use open source tools for that. So there is Backstab, EDR, Sandblast, all tools that have some proof of concepts of how you can disable those tools. But again, like, we also read GitHub, right? So if they use stuff from GitHub, we also react at detections. So at some point, that might also be blocked. And this and many other reasons, we believe, is that there is an increasing market for EDR killers. So basically, those are often tools that use concepts in those open source tools. They use a lot from there, or some techniques they develop by themselves and try to sell them basically on the darknet then. These tools usually use, or most of the time, use two techniques. The first of all, is legitimate driver abuse. So through legitimate drivers, you can, like, they have a legitimate case, and many of them are vulnerable, and they are often written poorly on security with security, and many of them have vulnerabilities, and it's easy to find them and also to exploit them. So it's also not that easy for an EDR system or as a company, like if you're providing EDR systems, to just block all of them, because many of them has a legitimate case. So you can't just say, no, you can't load that EDR driver, that Ethernet driver, and then they don't have internet access, for example. So that's one technique. The other one, which is a little bit harder, you can use leaked code signing certificates. So if you have a way to obtain some code signing certificate through the darknet, or you get through Microsoft's attestation signing, for example, you can actually try to sign your rootkit or malicious driver and get also some code running in the kernel. So there has also been some very interesting development in that area where attackers abuse code signing certificates. So if you heard about signature timestamp forging, in Windows there is a policy that says if you have an outdated driver that has a timestamp before the 29th July 2015, these drivers, and you have a driver signed with that code signing certificate, that outdated one, it will still load. And so since version 2000, Windows 10 16.07, all certificates have to get through that Windows hardware developer dashboard, where they have to get attestation signed. And that policy, that loophole, is another way where you have an outdated one and you can get through there. And what attackers basically found out, like 2020, or some reverse engineers, and which was reported again in Cisco this year, is that you can, through a series of hooks, you can basically use a leaked code signing certificate and sign your own drivers with it. So the hooks you have to basically do is, so there's a tool called Sign Tool you use to sign your driver. And the first hook you do is you hook cert verified timestamp or time validity. So basically in the code, what happens at some point if you try to sign it with a certificate, it has to check if that certificate is still valid. So you have a valid to and valid from. And if that one is outdated or not usable anymore, then you can't sign your driver. That's the first hook. So you pass it and you pass that validity check. The second hook you do is you have to hook get local time. And through that, you have a valid to and valid from. Let's say the valid to is from 2013 and the valid from is to 2014. You have to somehow pass a local time that is in that time frame. Otherwise, it's still not valid. So you have to pass a valid local time that is in between that time frame. So that is basically what they do. And through those hooks, you can then sign your driver. And there are two tools that are open source and do exactly that. It's FuckCert, verify time validity, and hook sign tool. So if you're interested, that's implemented there, and it's quite interesting. And also for EDR killers, it will be a topic in the slides later. So let's jump to the EDR killers. So the first one I'm going to show you is AuKill. So AuKill, we discovered this one in November 2022. And basically, it started off as a copy of Backstep. So if you ever heard about Backstep, it's an open source tool that uses a vulnerable version of Process Explorer to kill process-protected light processes. So basically, processes that usually you should not be able to kill if they are tamper protected. And the outstanding thing about AuKill is that depending on the version and the environment, the list of vendors changes. And this has led to some quite interesting examples we've collected. But first of all, to how AuKill is designed. So overall, AuKill has a very simple setup. So you have your load driver function, your drop driver function, where the driver is dropped on the system, depending on whether that driver is compressed in the memory or in the file or not. Maybe it's also sometimes embedded as plain text in the binary, depending on the version. It's dropped. Then this driver is loaded into memory. And from there, you will have different kind of threads running. Each thread that is running there has a different functionality and also targets a different part of an EDR system. So the first thread, what you might have is that it tries to disable the processes that are in that list and that are basically blacklisted through abusing that Process Explorer driver. The second thread, what you might see is that there is a thread called stop services, and it will try to stop the services. The third thread will maybe try to unload the driver. And this, again, changes really from version to version, and they continue to develop these different threads that run. So in the next screenshot, I hope the text is not too small, you can see some decompiled code from IDA Pro, where you can see different of those functions being called. So in the first thread here, you can see create thread being called, a function being called or passed over kill processes, and the list of the list of processes that are passed in there is G Microsoft proc list. That's basically the number of processes that are belongs to Microsoft, and it attempts to disable. And this thread will basically continue all the time. The second one here in the decompiled code is stop services. So you have a list of services that are passed to that function, and through that API function from Windows, I think it's change service config v, they try to keep it disabled all the time so that it doesn't rebirth itself like a phoenix. The third and fourth one here is basically the same functions where they try to kill Sophos related processes. So you have a list of Sophos processes in the first one, and then you have a list of services that are related to Sophos passed in the last one here. And again, this was like from a case where where we knew that Sophos runs on this system. We have also seen some different cases where we saw process names from Elasticsearch being passed there. We've seen processes from remote desktop tools like Splashtop, McAfee was in there. So we also wrote a blog article about this one. And if you're interested in the whole list, what we've seen, you can check up the blog article, and you can actually see there is a table down there, and also on our GitHub page, we have all the different vendors being targeted. What we also did, since this was from November, we saw the first sample. We continued tracking AuKill over the time. And, what's that? Oh, sorry. I thought I turned it off. That would have been bad here. Right. So what you can see is the development cycle here. So the first version in the 13th of November 2022, that's the compilation timestamp you see here that you extract from the PE file. You can fake compilation timestamps, but if they correlate so well into a timeline, then it's very unlikely that they kind of messed with it. And if you look at the timeline here, what I'm highlighting here is the version 1 compilation timestamp and the version 3 compilation timestamp. And the first scene, when it first popped up in our systems, internal systems, what's quite interesting is the time frame between the appearance of it and the time frame between the compilation timestamp and the point it appeared the first time is always quite low. This continues for the other versions too here. Version 4 and version 5. What this kind of indicates, it's very hard to prove this, but if you imagine that this is like an EDR killer that is sold on the darknet, what might happen is that if somebody says, okay, well, I'm trying to use your service and I'm buying your EDR killer, these are the kind of EDR systems I'm trying to turn off. That might be that they really change the list of vendors depending on the environment they are attacking, and then this is compiled, and that's at least my theory why you see such a low difference between the compilation timestamp and the first scene timestamp. We have linked AuKill to a number of different incidents and also ransomware groups like Lockbit, Medusa Locker, but Colin will talk about that more in detail later. What we've also did, we tracked the features that were we've seen over the time in AuKill. And version 1, like I said, is like very much a slightly modified version of Backstep. There was not really much original stuff in there. A lot of stuff was copied. Version 2 evolved then, where they did some really weird stuff trying to delete Sophos from the disk, which did not work in that case. Then they added some functionality in there to remove services. So that function I've shown before, where they basically try to kill the services or stop the services, that happened in version 2. In version 4, they added some decompression in memory. So before they had that Process Explorer driver, that vulnerable one, which always has to be below 1632. It was plain text in the binary in the AirData section, I think. And from there, they actually added compression. So it is first decompressed in memory, and then it is dropped onto the system. They added some functionality to unloading drivers through the API functions. Version 5 introduced some different ways of trying to escalate privileges. So previously, the way they try to escalate privileges is that you have a trusted installer service running on Windows, and they try to escalate privileges via token impersonation. And before they did not check if that service is running. Now, since that version, they basically enable it. And what the most interesting functions, versions were 5, 6, and 7. That's where you saw like some really experimental stuff happening. So before they only used Process Explorer, but if you reverse engineer the version 6, you see some strings there where they use some Windows kernel explorer.sys. So you see the name. You also see some checks whether that file exists, but there is no functionality in there of where they try to use it somehow. So I guess that was a very experimental one. Version 7, they switched to another experimental one, which is proclaunchmon.sys. So there's definitely lots of things going on there, and the latest one was from July, I think. So its development is going on. Yeah, they added some more code obfuscation and some trying to bypass hooks, but that was all not so bad to reverse engineer, so it's okay. So they also switched to using Process Explorer 17.02. So tamper-protected processes will not be disabled anymore, but other processes. So that's also an interesting development. So that's for AuKill. The second one is Poortry. So if you heard the talk yesterday where we talked about MS-signed drivers, we do a really bad job at naming things in our industry. So you name it burn cigar, Poortry, APC helper, KAPC helper. I'm sticking to Poortry here to make it easier. It's basically was discovered December, November 2022 in a joint disclosure between Sentinel-1, Mandia, and Sophos, where we discovered that we saw multiple EDR killers carrying a Microsoft signature, where they managed to get through Microsoft's attestation signing process. And this is basically a custom rootkit. Solely purpose of it is to disable EDR processes on the system. It is always delivered with a loader named StoneStub. So like I said, they basically always belong together. And both of them are very often packed or always packed with commercial packers like VM Protect, Themida, and also interesting that Poortry always comes with a leaked code signing certificate. So looking at multiple versions, we've seen NVIDIA, the leaked NVIDIA code signing certificate, lots of Chinese code signing certificates that were leaked, Microsoft ones. Well, we have to say I've not seen a Microsoft one since a long time now. And if we look at like the files itself, so the first one is StoneStub, which is the loader. Again, like with all EDR killers, the architecture is always very simple. So you have, in this case, the unpacking process, which is that commercial packer that will load the unpacked version into memory. Then the drivers are loaded. So the difference between AuKill here is that they, in an attack, like in an incident, what you often see is that StoneStub and Poortry are dropped separately. So the attackers drop both instead of having StoneStub dropping or having Poortry embedded into the binary. So in an attack, you always see those both dropped separately. Then this driver is loaded, always placed in the same path. And you will just enter like an endless loop where you have different processes you're trying to disable, basically. So in this case, you see a lot of Sophos-related processes it tries to kill. So the functionality of disabling those processes is basically done by talking with Poortry. So once Poortry is loaded, IOCTL codes are sent to that driver, and this driver will then terminate those processes. So in this slide here, you can see again EDR decompiled code, where you see that if you saw the talk yesterday, the distinct symbolic name, KAPC helper link, which if you look at many examples, you see that one happening or appearing very often. This is also a very old version, so it's from 2022, mid-2022, where they did not use commercial packers before yet. And this one was signed by the leaked NVIDIA code signing certificate. You can see some attempts to, or some calls to the object notify routines from Windows at the beginning, where they call, pass some function in there to disable Sophos routines. So the way this basically works is that it tries to prevent some Sophos processes from running. If you know about object notify routines, you basically create some callbacks into the kernel that if, let's say, a create process is called, then a callback to the drivers is triggered, and that callback checks for specific process names. And if the process name match, then don't start it. This was, again, this was an old version, where in that version we've seen 3 IOCTL codes, which was to activate the driver, deactivate, and to kill it, to kill the processes, not the driver. And it has evolved a lot. So there's this list of features that the latest version from, I think, April, I think, you can see lots of different functionalities being added, like, for example, deleting files, copying files, force copy files, so lots of file modifications. This functionality that you had before, where they try to unregister or register these threat notification, object notification routines, that has moved into a separate functionality. And also the functionality to reboot the system. So if I look at incidents, what I see very often is that this kill process routine, activate and deactivate, is used very often. The other ones I have yet to see a real case where some fancy stuff is done with that. But usually what you often see with Poortry is really prior an encryption ransomware attack, it is dropped, and then ransomware comes after, like Colin will talk about which ones we saw being deployed after Poortry. Another interesting timeline I wanted to share with you about Poortry is that around August, we've seen some cases in telemetry where there was an attack. And again, what happens first in an attack, you have initial access. So on 19th of August, we've seen initial access on a machine. What happened next in the time frame between 10 p.m. and it was midnight, 20 minutes after midnight here. What we've seen is that they got initial access and they created some remote desktop access to that machine with Splashtop. So Splashtop, if you know TeamViewer and AnyDesk, you also know Splashtop. It's basically the same kind of software where you can get remote access to the system and do modifications. What happened next is that we've seen the first try to load Poortry, this time signed with Bobsoft. So Bobsoft is also a known leaked code signing certificate that is used by a bunch of different malware families. So it's not really unique to Poortry. So after that didn't work, what happened next is they also tried again for some reason to load Poortry with the Bobsoft certificate, which I didn't understand at this point. But then 30 seconds later, what we've seen is they load again Poortry, but this time you have a new code signing certificate or signer name named Evangel Technology HK Limited. And if you look that up, it's actually a company, a Chinese company, And again, it's a leaked one. So it's quite interesting in this case if you look at the timeline. So my hypothesis here is, again, I think like the second one was maybe a mistake, like they didn't want to try loading it, like, I don't know, switch the files or something like that. But interestingly, like after this one failed, they get another one in with a new code signing certificate. So I'm like not sure if like maybe they are stacking up code signing certificates, which is quite troublesome. So in this case, then the machine, like the network connectivity was cut off and it was mitigated. But it's quite interesting to see that timeline and seeing like right after the first fail, they just switched to another one. And would have been interesting to see like if like 3, 4, 5 times it failed, if you each time see a new one appearing. So yeah, that's for the technical part. I'll hand over to Colin here to talk a little bit about threat intelligence.
Thank you, Andreas. And just wanted to take this moment to give a big shout out to my coworker, Matt Wixie, who could not make it, but I definitely appreciated his work towards contributing towards this research. So a quick background on the criminal marketplace around EDR killers. We took a look at a couple different places where these threat actors communicate, and what we found is that prices for these EDR killers range from occasionally a few hundred to, in some cases, thousands. And in general, on the listings, they kept it fairly high level and didn't get too detailed, but there's still some insight that we can gain just by reviewing over some of this marketplace. So the first kind of criminal solution that we'll be covering is AV Killer. This was advertised on a forum in November of 2022. They mention a variety of different vendors here, Sophos, Windows Defender, Centennial One, and they mentioned that if you're interested, they could potentially sell you the source code. It should be worth noting that according to this seller, that this solution would not work in countries that are friendly to Russia, which is certainly a theme that we've seen in other malware outside of EDR killers. And now on these criminal marketplaces, they have these arbitration rooms where they can settle disputes. I'm sure many of us have experienced when you buy something maybe on Amazon and it doesn't quite live up to expectations. And in the case with this AV Killer bundle, that's exactly what happened. This gentleman or threat actor who is screenshotted here, they paid $150 up front and they were going to pay the rest after they tested it out. And unfortunately, it didn't quite live up to the expectations, and they started to kind of air out that dispute publicly on the forum. And if you're interested in more of some of these conflict between scammers, I strongly encourage checking out our blog that was published last December called The Scammers Who Scam Scammers, led by my coworker Matt Wixie. And we found that by looking at a 12-month period, the amount of US dollars that was lost by scammers to scammers was over $1 million. So definitely check that out. And then here you can see some more of the discussion about just this particular AV Killer solution. And they mentioned that it just doesn't really live up to expectations. And funny enough, the original seller ended up blackmailing this criminal for posting on the forum that they were unhappy with the service. And lastly, after the end of this arbitration, they determined that the original seller of that AV Killer solution needed to make some improvements and that it really wasn't living up to what they had originally advertised. Bundles are a great way to encourage consumers, or in this case, criminals, from purchasing everything at a one-stop shop. And we certainly see that in the criminal underground. Typically, these EDR killers are sold alongside of other solutions known as cryptors, where they will help you take your payload and ensure it passes an AV scan. And these prices can range up to even $3,000. In this screenshot from earlier this year, the same user who was having that dispute earlier about the AV Killer solution is mentioning that they have a bundle, that they're having a 50% discount. So we can see that some criminals apply marketing strategies as well to try and sell these things. And in this case, as again, you can see quite a list of few different vendors that are targeted. So not just Sophos, but many other solutions targeted. And that kind of implies that it's more of a generic technique as opposed to an individual exploit targeting a specific security solution. This is the full list of different products that this specific listing was mentioning. You probably see some that you're familiar with on there here. And even more stuff being bundled in. They mention EDRs in particular. I think it's interesting that Kaspersky shows up on a lot of these advertisements, as that might not be what you're thinking as some of their targets. And a lot of these use escrow payment, where you basically pay some of the money and then there gives you an opportunity to test out the product before you finally finalize the transaction. In this case, you can see a bundle where there's quite a few different products. We have Metasploit, Cobalt Strike. One that maybe people might not be familiar with on here is Zoom Info. A lot of times these criminal groups use Zoom Info to determine how big of a company or victim that they've targeted. And if you look at postings on data leak sites on the Onion network, you'll notice that a lot of the descriptions about victims can match what's on Zoom Info. And so that's certainly interesting to see that being sold. And then on the bottom half of the screenshot here, we have a criminal who mentions that they strictly work in US, Canada, Germany, UK, and France, and that they don't work on any schools, universities, or nonprofits or states. And I say work as in perform criminal intrusions. Earlier in the presentation, we mentioned the tool Backstab. It's on GitHub. It has over 1,000 stars on the GitHub platform. And that leverages Proc Explorer to advertise as an EDR killer. And so in this screenshot, there's some discussion about it, but it's mentioned that it's considered poor OPSEC or probably detected by many different vendors. In some cases, some of the people that we saw advertising these later got banned for being a ripper. So there definitely are scammers scamming scammers within the EDR killers market. In this case, this user was mentioning that they had a demo of Windows Defender and that it was only $600. So maybe they're looking to make some quick cash and scam regardless of if they got their account banned. We've talked about code signing certificates as well. We've definitely seen that there seems to be an adjacent market selling code signing services. In particular, here we have some screenshots from 2021 where users are talking about, the top half of this user says they have a friend who used to do some game hacking or game modding and now they want to get into malware. Where should they look? Which is definitely in line with some of the overlaps between game hacking and EDR killing. On this bottom screenshot, we can see a user is linking to the Microsoft documentation in Russian language about driver signing. I know I like documentation, and it's clear that some criminals definitely take advantage of that documentation as well. And if you didn't catch our talk yesterday, be sure to keep an eye out for the presentation video because there's a lot of overlapping content, and it's definitely really high-quality research by Andrew Brandt and Andrew. Continuing on, looking at some different code signing services. This is a listing from earlier this year where they mention a price of $4.5K. And one thing to note here is the delivery time of 1 to 2 weeks. That seems to be fairly consistent with some of these other EDR killing and certificate signing services. Moving on to another listing, also from March of this year. In this case, the user ended up linking to the official policy on Microsoft's website about code signing. So we know that these criminals are studying the official documentation, they're looking at what's allowed, and they're discussing that with their fellow criminals, even in some cases telling them how to navigate through the Microsoft portal and get around some of these things, or at least attempt to. This is a post from July of last year, where a Russian-speaking user was selling a service for $5,000, and they mentioned they can get your executable DLL or PowerShell script or whatever, and to contact him, and they would start the escrow process. This user ended up following up a few months later in November of last year, mentioning some changes, particularly now that they only accept a max of 2 EVs a day. And then they continued to offer some of the same services around the same price point with the same communication techniques. Here is a post from 2022 as well, and we're going to go to the translation now. In this posting, the user mentions that they know a few of the other sellers, and they sell around the same price. They're not competing with the other sellers on the market. They say it's not an easy topic, and all these sellers in this area are hard workers, and they won't move on the price. You pay for quality and service because they know how the CA works and operates. So based off this post, it seems like some of the main actors involved in offering these services are in communications with each other. Potentially they've had a monopoly on the criminal as a service marketplace. And in this case, they also note that all of the solutions on the marketplace take some time to deliver, typically 1 to 2 weeks, and I think that's due to the nature of these signing programs. And lastly, to summarize the criminal marketplace, there are scams, but overall there does seem to be some positive feedback. And then again, a lot of these tools are based off of Backstab, which leverages Process Explorer, although there have been some changes, as mentioned earlier in the slides, over time. We're just going to quickly here talk about some of the cases we've seen using EDR killers from our Managed Detection Response and Incident Response Consulting line. These are just some of the top 5 EDR killers that we've seen. GMUR, which is related to anti-rootkit removal, is a very popular one. Avast, we've talked about that in both our presentations, with an AuKill and Poortry. Out of all these different families, one that I want to mention is all caps data leak group. We've seen some threat actors kind of moving away from ransomware, and although I have this title as ransomware, in this case that is just data theft extortion, where they steal files and leave a note on the desktop. 2 other ones that show up in multiple columns here are BlueHat and Lockbit. Those are, in my opinion, the 2 biggest ransomware as a service programs, and although the TTPs can change significantly on an affiliate to affiliate basis, generally speaking, Lockbit and BlueHat, also known as Alpha V, affiliates tend to operate with a bit more professionalism compared to other ransomware threat actors that we see. And then just to quickly highlight 2 campaigns where we saw these EDR killers showing up. The first one is from earlier this year, involving Proxy Not Shell. The threat actors compromised the Exchange server, and the first thing they did was install GoToAssist, a legitimate remote management tool. We call these dual-use agents, as they can be used for legitimate purposes, but also to further a criminal intrusion. After executing some malware, we observed that through GoToAssist, they downloaded drivers and scripts to actually load that in an attempt to remove antivirus and ultimately deploy Cuba ransomware. One other kind of one-day campaign where a threat actor was leveraging a known vulnerability was the Log4j VMware Horizon campaign. This took place in 2020. We saw threat actors taking advantage of this exploit to install more dual-use agents, which is a common theme, and then from there, loading different EDR killers, Mimikatz, PSExec, and in this case, that intrusion was attributed to Monty ransomware, which is built off of the Conti source code, but I don't believe is directly related to the original Conti threat actors. And to provide some conclusions and key takeaways from our research, the first key takeaway is that this is a problem that is here to stay. There are criminals that are making money off of it, there are criminals that like taking advantage of it, and it's something that is going to continue to evolve, as we've seen with just timelines from over the past year and a half. Another takeaway is that criminals like to take advantage of vulnerabilities in legitimate drivers, and it's important to be tracking when those new vulnerabilities show up or when drivers might be leaked and then can be taken advantage of. And then the last takeaway that I have is to monitor for EDR killers being detected. There's a connotation that a threat actor who's deploying ransomware has admin access and they're going to be able to disable security solutions. And what we've seen in our research is that's oftentimes not the case. There are many different situations where maybe a victim has multiple solutions, or maybe they have a corporate network that they just merged in and there's a trust relationship, but oftentimes these threat actors can struggle with actually removing EDR and AV solutions, and so that we see these kind of sys files and other EDR killers showing up during the earlier stages of the intrusion and can provide a great opportunity to detect and start to respond and remediate the compromised hosts. Thank you.